Good afternoon. Good afternoon to this very cold Mongolian weather. Sorry we couldn't bring you nicer sunny weather, Zara. It's really a pleasure to be introducing Zara Pogossian to you. When I asked her to come and give a talk this year in our Armenian Studies series, she did mention that she was going to UCLA, and we were able to bring her here before she takes this trip to UCLA and speaks at a conference there on looking at the Mongols from the margins. And so we are co-sponsoring this talk with UCLA Department of History, as well as the MEMS program, the Medieval and Early Modern program in the History Department, at least housed in the History Department as well. This is our last lectures in the Armenian Studies series for the winter semester, and so it is even more of an honor to end it with you. We're going to have next month, for those of you who are interested in a very different topic, our Haidosian lecture on March 13th by Eric Pogossian, a slight change of consonants here. And he's a playwright, a novelist, and an actor himself who's worked mainly on, you probably know him through Suburbia or maybe talk radio. Some of his screen plays were translated by Oliver Stone into film as well. But he's now working on a nonfiction book called Finding Nemesis, I think, which is about the assassination of Talat Pasha by a group of Armenian terrorists in 1914 in Berlin. And so he will be speaking to us about the writing of this book on the 13th of March at 7 p.m. in Umma. Zara Pogossian received both her master's as well as her PhD in medieval studies at the Central European University at Budapest. She currently teaches the history of medieval Europe and Byzantium at John Cabot University in Rome. And she's had several prestigious postdoc fellowships at the Kate Hamburger Collegium and an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship at the University of Tübingen. Zara is a scholar after my heart, a rigorous historian interested in asceticism, apocalyptics, and the Mongols now. An unlikely trio, at least at first glance. Zara has written about female asceticism and ascetic communities in early Christian Armenia, exploring the role of women in the spread of Christianity. Her research charts out really meticulously, and this is why I'm saying she's a rigorous scholar, how Armenian kings established monasteries like the Sevan Monastery as part of their economic and political projects. And she really built up on the work of the Grand Dame of this medieval period in Armenian history, namely Nina Garsoryan. But I think what she's doing, which is new, is that she's really opening up a space to reflect on how closely sovereign benefit, at least in this case, and sacred benefit are closely harnessed together, and how, in a way, the language of kingship and the language of religion are together crafting or being crafted simultaneously. From monasticism and kingship, Zara's research turns to Armenian apocalyptic traditions, beginning with the Silesian period of the 11th to 13th centuries to the Mongol conquests of Greater Armenia in the 13th century. She's currently working on a critical edition of the Prophecies of Agathon, a medieval Armenian apocalyptic text dating back to the Crusades. This rich source allows Zara to listen to connected apocalyptic languages that give texture to shared Christian, Jewish, and Muslim fears and anxieties in medieval Anatolia. Today, Zara will be talking about perhaps a more positive aspect of Mongol rule, where elite Armenian women benefited from the state of war. Please join me in welcoming Zara Pogossian.
Thank you, Catherine, for this splendid introduction. And thank you all for coming here and dedicating your time to listening to me and to my talk. A few years ago, as I was reading colophons of Armenian manuscripts from the 13th century, while doing research on the Mongols and apocalyptic speculations in the Armenian sources, I came across a colophon written in 1261 at the end of a gospel. Currently, this manuscript is held in the Institute of Ancient Manuscripts in Yerevan, excuse me, known as the Matinadaran. This is what the manuscript said. I, Hasan Jalal Davla, went to the east. I have done a very literal translation, so it could be done with better English, but I've tried to be very literal, so forgive me for that. I, Hasan Jalal Davla, went to the east to the king of the archers, and to the north, personally with my family and household, on account of establishing peace for the church. Me and my spouse Maman, and my child given by God, Atabek Ivane, we went to the northeast, and then I went to the edge of the world, to the king who was Möngke Khan. And having stayed there for 5 years, I returned home. And also Maman and Atabek returned. And they arrived at their destination while I stayed in Tabriz. When the point of death having reached her, Maman died in Christ. And arriving there, I found my bride home full of mourning and inconsolable tears, because she was the comforter and the consolation of all the armies and cavalrymen, as well as the churches and priests. The loss of his wife motivated Hasan to donate the illuminated gospel at his possession to the Catholicos Nerses of the Albanians. So here I'm speaking about Caucasian Albania, or Arvank in the Armenian sources, in memory of Maman. What struck me in this colophon was not the act of the donation in memory of one's wife, or the expression of affection in her regard, but the association of Maman with the army, even to the point of specifying that she was the consoler of cavalrymen. My original, rather spontaneous hypothesis when reading this passage was that the Armenians, who were exposed to the Mongols for now about 30 years, we're talking about 1261, the conquest of Armenia occurred in 1230s, for about 30 years, thus a generation, had adopted some of the mores of the nomadic Mongol populations whose structures were such that women took an active part in economic as well as political or even military aspects of life. Yet, as I continued my research, I felt that this was too simplistic an explanation. So what kind of changes occurred in the structure of the Armenian society upon the Mongol conquests and their domination that made such a colophon conceivable for a husband to write after his wife had passed away? Of course, let me emphasize that we're talking about high society. I will later return to specifically the personalities and who they are. They are quite significant. The first raiding expedition of the Mongols to the southern Caucasus occurred in 1220s. At this point in history, there was no one unified and politically independent entity known as Armenia. In this lecture, I will refer to the territories inhabited by the Armenians south of the Caucasus as Greater Armenia or Armenian homeland for convenience's sake. So, I'll have another map later. Of course, this period coincides with the existence of another independent Armenian state, the Cilician Kingdom of Armenia in Eastern Mediterranean. I think here we can see just the tip of it. Okay, and this would refer very roughly, there are no exact borders, to what I say historical Armenia, or the Greater Armenia. There are a variety of sources that help the historian in her or his reconstruction of the events. Let me just briefly mention the main ones from our period. From historiography, the major work is the history of the Armenians of Kyriakos Ganzaketsi. So he was located, or at least he originated in Ganzak. So his perspective is a northeastern perspective. His friend, Vartan Arevelsi, they were also fellows in their studies. They were students of a famous Vartapet, or doctor of the church, Vanakan. And the importance of Kyriakos is that he was imprisoned by the Mongols along with Vanakan. So he had direct experience. He lived amongst them and he had direct experience and left very interesting testimonies about the Mongols. Then there is the history of the region of Sisakan by Stepanos Orbelian. It ends around 1300. So Kyriakos' work's last entry is dated to 1266. Vartan is somewhat more. It ends around 1270. Stepanos Orbelian, 1300. Grigor Agnertsi, who worked in Cilicia in the monastery of Agner, but he was in touch with the elite of the Cilician society, and he may have known personally or could have had an opportunity to talk even to King Hetum, who made the trip to Karakorum, or his brother Sambat. So he also had access to first-hand information. Of course, a vast resource are the colophons of Armenian manuscripts. And I assume the vast majority of them, there may be others not published, but there is a collection of them, of 13th century colophons, which makes their use quite easy, quite available for scholars of Armenian studies, and of course of inscriptions. I must say, with regard to the inscriptions, the majority of them have been published from the northeastern parts of Armenia or from the former Soviet Armenia. We have also inscriptions from Ani. So in a way, the information we get from the inscriptions is partial. They leave the impression that everything that was going on at that time was happening near the monastery of Sanahin or Ani or Haghpat. But in fact, it's simply because we don't have enough published material from other parts. Okay. A century and a half before our period, so just to give you the historical background and explanation of some of the ideology about which I will talk, the last Arzrunid king, David Senekerim, voluntarily exchanged his ancestral domain of Vaspurakan for territories near Sebasti, today's Sevas, and the adjacent regions. So this happens in 1020s. The sources justify Senekerim's choice, amongst other reasons, as because of his perceived danger of the Seljuk attacks and the realization of his inability to fend for his paternal lands. Somewhat later, the capital of the Bagratis, so the northern kingdom, I don't have a Bagratit map, sorry. The northern kingdom, who held preeminence, in fact, or at least claimed to have preeminence, was taken by the Byzantines in 1045, only to fall shortly afterwards to the Seljuks in 1064. But the Bagratuni branch, yes, the parallel branch of Kars, also terminated in 1066 when King Gagik received the castle of Tsamandos. The 12th century marks the domination of the Seljuks in Armenia. They were not the only ones to control Greater Armenia, even if they were the most significant ones. There was a number of Muslim polities, such as the Shahi Armens of Khalat, the Shaddadids of Ani, the Danishmendids in the south, or the Emirs of Ganzak. Some older Armenian dynasties continued to exist. Nevertheless, even though representing only a shadow of their earlier might. One may mention the Mamikonian Tornikians of Taron, or a branch of the Bagratuni Skurikans in Lori in northern Armenia. In northern Armenia. The family's burial ground, the monastery of Sanahin, to which I will return, was symbolically quite important, and we will see that there is rivalry for these sites, for these symbolically charged locations, by the newly emerging nobility. The disappearance of the great princely houses, let's say in the second half of the 11th, first half of the 12th century, combined with new ways of making money, such as through trade, created an environment conducive of the rise of new persons or new people, usually via military exploits. Thus, this period, especially the second half of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th, was one of recovery and the appearance of new nobility of Armenian stock, particularly under the aegis of the Georgian kingdom. The latter experienced an apogee under the Bagratit king Georgi III and his daughter Tamar the Great, who is termed as king in the sources and not as queen. Here one must mention two great rival families that emerged in historical Armenia, particularly in the northeastern parts, the Zakharids and the Orbelians. The Zakharids, known as Haghartsin in Georgian sources, which means long-armed, and their rise to power and conquest of territories in northeastern Armenia is perhaps the most exemplary case of the modes and models of how this new nobility came to prominence. We will see some of the same strategies undertaken by other Armenian families somewhat later under the Mongol domination. The name of the family goes back to the eponymous forefather Zakare, about whom we know very little, but whose grandson Sarkis, in some inscriptions called Sarkis the Great, received the rank of Amir Spasalar, the general commander of the armed forces of the Georgian kingdom from King Georgi III in 1187. This charge passed on to his son Zakare. Sarkis seems to be mentioned already in an inscription of Haghartsin in 1155. This is the extent of the Zakharid domain, which they reconquered from the Seljuks, and the Monastery of Haghartsin and Sanahin, which received sponsorship from these and other noble, rising nobility. Sarkis's rise to power was most likely due to his own personal skills and abilities, but he lacked blue blood. He was, of course, well aware of the prestige that an older, preferably royal lineage could confer upon his or his family's rising fortunes. Not only, such a lineage could also help him in successfully competing with other families who claimed rulership on Armenian lands, including the control of the symbolically important Ani, the capital of the Bagratuni kingdom. One such potent family was that of the Orbelians, or Orbeli in the Georgian sources. However, after the failed rebellion of the Orbelians against King Georgi III in 1177 and their fall from grace, the Zakharids, once acting under the Orbelian command, now continued to improve their hold on power unchallenged. Part of their strategy of territory control was based on clever marriage alliances. Sarkis himself married the sister of Kurd Sahagtuht. This Kurd is known from other sources as serving at the court of Georgi III and held the fortress of Mahkanaberd. There have been claims that they belong to an Artsrunid family. However, not all scholars agree, because it seems that the Artsrunid claim emerges in the 13th century when the grandson of Kurd, his name was Sadun, became a significant ruler submitted to the Mongols. So his rise to power was defined by the Mongols, and then he claimed Artsrunid origin or Artsrunid descent. Sarkis's children, both daughters and sons, very successful ones, the most successful in this time, Ivane and Zakare, came to play a prominent part in the real or imagined lineage and propaganda of their family and in creating a tight web of relationships. Zakare and Ivane, for example, used ambivalent wording in an Arabic language inscription dated to 1195 or 1198 on the castle of Ambert, which implied, after they conquered the castle, that they had Artsruni origin. Let us remember that the Artsrunids held the kingdom of Vaspurakan in southern Armenia, and some scholars have interpreted both the use of the Arabic language and the claim to Artsrunid descent as an early attempt of propaganda aimed at recovering southern Armenia from the Danishmendids. Okay. Somewhat later, an inscription of Haghartsin, here we go, dated to 1212, Ivane claimed that the Zakharids belonged to the Bagratuni house. Moreover, their mother, Sahagtuht, called herself Mother of Kings Zakare and Ivane, and in inscriptions, colophons, these two are often termed as kings or Kaisar, and also very often patron or patron. So this was in a church in Ani, a church of Akhchkapert. So the location is very important because Ani was symbolically conferred legitimacy, or the Zakharids tried to get both Zakharids and Orbelis Ani as a way of legitimizing their rule. Ivane's wife, Khoshak, called herself in two inscriptions of Shiragavan and Khatskong as the queen of the Armenians and the Georgians. In the consolidation of power of the Zakharids, women of the family came to play a prominent role through dynastic marriages too. While the strengthening of alliances through marriage was nothing new, the strategy employed by the Zakharids does have some new features, given the contemporary historical conditions, as well as the Zakharids and other newly emerging family status as newcomers. It is here that one may notice new types of roles conferred upon women, something that will be pushed even further after the Mongol domination. Thus, there were at least two strategies which reflected the need of the family. On the one hand, the consolidation of real power by forging the links to other newcomers, and the control of the territory reconquered from the Seljuk through this new lesser nobility. So this was one strategy. The other one was bringing in the prestige of older families whenever possible in order to legitimate the rulership of the Zakharids in Armenian territories that once belonged to older but now disappeared Armenian nobility. Thus, one of Zakhare's sister, Zakhare and Ivane's sister, Vaneni, married the last of the Lori Gyurikans, Abbas II, securing at least some connection to the Bagratids. Vaneni, her name was Vaneni, or Nana in some other inscriptions, took her rank of a queen seriously, even though the territories under her husband's control, which presumably passed to her after his death, and his real power was only a shadow of the former Bagratid might. At the untimely death of her husband, Vaneni built a bridge. This happened sometime after 1192 when Abbas II died. But probably before the turn of the century. And on a khachkar, a cross stone, on the left bank of the river, she left an inscription where she emphasized both her Bagratuni connection and commemorated her own paternal family. I hope I put this up. Yes. I, Vaneni, daughter of the Prince of Princes Sarkis, son of Zakhare, wife of King Abbas, who died untimely and left us in the dark, built this bridge and raised this cross in his memory and for my consolation and for the long life of my parents and my brothers. So it's very important how she's positioning herself. She's a wife of a Bagratuni, so she's a queen, but at the same time she's a sister and the daughter of important persons, or at least persons whose importance is growing. The construction of the bridge itself was already a statement of status, which fulfilled several functions simultaneously. It was a pious donation to the monastery. Here's the bridge, which is still surviving and not in a good condition. It's another view. It was a pious donation to the monastery, marking her as a generous patron. Let us remember, as I mentioned earlier, Sanahin was the burial ground of the Gyurikan Bagratid kings, and its support seems to have been fundamental in crushing the Orbelian rebellion in 1177. The bridge obviously improved communication and must have brought economic benefits to the monastery and the region. Yet, perhaps above all, it emphasized Vaneni's rank as a queen and a sister of important persons. According to the law code of Mekhitar Kosh, the construction of bridges was the prerogative of kings. Thus, Vaneni emphasized her and presumably her family's connection to royal blood. Not only, this type of construction was unique for its secular nature too. This and other examples speak for the fact that the Zakharids, and as we shall see, the rival Orbelians, desired to tap into the nostalgia of the loss of the Bagratuni kingdom and the prestige that the family carried. Moreover, their connection to the Armenian Bagratids could be viewed even as a statement against the Georgian Bagratids, under whose suzerainty they function, but they may have wanted to present themselves as equals. an issue, and the Georgian Bagratis were issues of a cadet line at that, so they could wish to have a claim to belonging to senior lines of the royal Armenian dynasty. Let us talk for a minute about the Orbelians. After I drink water, please. This was the other powerful family in the second half of the 12th century, whose functions first precipitated after the revolt of 1177, but later revived, and who were one of the greatest beneficiaries of the Mongol domination of Armenia. Ivane Orbelian, the leader along with his brother Liparit Orbelian of the rebellion against Georgi III, was married to a Bagratuni princess, Kyrikan Princess Rusudan, very likely the daughter of the king Kyurike II, so the sister of Abbas, whom Zachary's sister married. There is some discussion whether this Rusudan is the sister or the daughter of Kyurike. It seems likely that we are talking about the daughter. Thus, the Orbelians' alliances with a better-known and more illustrious Bagratid lineage was a strategy that they seem to have used a generation before the Zakharids. Slightly prior to the rebellion, Ivane Orbelian and his wife Rusudan showcased their patronage and restoration of churches in Ani, as well as royal tombs in Haghpat, in an effort to propagate a continuity between the Bagratid and Orbelian noble dynasties. Just like in the case of Vaneni, also here, it was Rusudan who conferred, a woman who conferred the aura of legitimacy to the Orbelians. Already in 1173, an inscription from Sanahin by Ivane Orbelian makes a connection between the royal tombs at Sanahin and, he says, our forefathers, thus again symbolically linking the two dynasties. As discussed above, similar ambivalent and ambitious language or wording was used by Zachariah and Ivane in their inscriptions on Ambert. According to Stepanos Orbelian, who, as I said, wrote in the 13th century, and he represents this family, so we can imagine that he has a lot of biases and gives a lot of propaganda to his family. According to Stepanos Orbelian, after the rebellion, the only surviving legitimate heir was a child, Liparit, who lived with his mother in Nakhchivan. Later, the mother Khatun was forcibly married to the Muslim ruler of Nakhchivan. Always according to Stepanos, at some point, it seems around 1201, 1203, the Amir Spasalar Zakare, thus before 1212 when he died, discovered the existence of Liparit. Possibly he needed his men in southwestern locations of his territories and orchestrated his and his mother's escape from her Muslim husband. It was the Zakharid brothers' intention to marry Liparit to Ivane's daughter Tamti, a marriage alliance that did not occur. So they continued these marriage alliances through the daughters, which created allies who owed not only their career to them, but also were tied to them through marriages, through family ties. Based on the rivalry of the Orbelians and the Zakharids, the Orbelians' efforts to appropriate Bagratuni legacy through marriage, one appreciates even more the importance of Vaneni's marriage to Kurigan King Abbas II more fully. However, as symbolically significant as it must have been, from the benefit of hindsight, we may say that it reflected nostalgia for the past, but it didn't look to the future. Yet, the other Zakharid ladies' marriages did look to the future, to the newly rising military men, rather than the past, and were aimed at creating a web of alliances that would turn out to be significant in the future. Thus, another sister, Khorisha, married Vakhtan Tangik, the lord of Khachen. She was the mother of Jalal Davla, the man who wrote the Colophon at the death of his wife, the husband of Mamkan. And written sources such as the history of Kyriakos Ganzakidze, colophons and inscriptions leave no doubt that Hasan Jalal of the Colophon was one of the most eminent Armenian princes of the 13th century, allied with the Zakharids. Kyriakos Ganzakidze reserves high praise for his mother Khorishat, so the Zakharid princess, for her piety and ascetic lifestyle, going as far as comparing her to Queen Helen, who singularly is defined as the wife of King Abgar. I won't go into that why he's making this connection. It will take us too far away from our main topic. But if you're interested, you can ask me later. Upon the death of her husband, she made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where she died. Vakhtang's territorial power base was the castle of Khokhanabert, now in the military zone between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There were other pious donations sponsored by Hasan Jalal and others specifically by his wife. Thus, while Hasan Jalal built the Monastery of Ganjasar, the Gavit, or the atrium, was sponsored by his wife. The inscription specifically cites only her as the sponsor of the construction, which presumes she had her own wealth, her own capital, and could invest it in the ways she wanted, presumably in agreement with her husband. But claiming her as the sole sponsor, for me, signifies that. Thus, sources do speak of Hasan Jalal and Maman, emphasizing their piety. However, they do not provide any detail as to why Maman would be considered the consoler of the army, other than rhetorical effect. Thus, on the one hand, Maman is praised for her pious donation and constructions, something that was not unique, that was kind of women's way of their own propaganda since the 9th century construction of monasteries. But on the other hand, she also faced a long journey along with her husband, first to the Golden Horde to meet Bati, and we learn this from Kyriakos Ganzakidze, who gives more details about their trip. And then they came back. She seems like she didn't go to Karakorum with her husband. And she's being mourned as a consoler of the army, so there must be more going on there than we can get from our sources, and perhaps further research can indicate something else. The line of the nobles of Khachen, issues of the marriage of Maman and Hasan Jalal, took their name from their energetic father. They are called as Jalalians. However, the significance of the Jalalians' relationship with the Zakharids, so it was the Zakharids first who were trying to get legitimacy through the Bagratis. Now we have lesser nobility who get their legitimacy from Zakharids, and they again emphasize the importance of the female line of the family. It is apparent, for example, in the Honomastics. Hasan Jalal's brothers were named Ivane and Zakare after their uncle. Hasan's own son, mentioned in the Colophon, is Ivane Atabek, thus taking both the name and the title of his illustrious uncle and namesake. The case of Hasan Jalal and other princes who married into Zakharid women were in a way a replica of what the Zakharids of the Zakharid princes a generation earlier. This kind of marriage alliances, of course, were beneficial from all sides, not only for the Zakharids, who got their men who could be their local representatives for the territory control, but also for these new dynasties. Perhaps the best case of emphasizing the Zakharid lineage through the female line is that of the Dopyang. The latter took their name from Dop, the sister of Ivane and Zakare, who married Hasan, belonging to a family with roots in Artsakh. The son of Dop and Hasan, Prince Grigor, participated in the Mongol sack and conquest of Sebastia along with his maternal second cousin Avak. This Avak was the son of Ivane, who became Atabek after his father's death. Kyriakos Ganzakidze defines him as Grigor's son of Dop, thus and describes how he saved many Christian lives at the sake of Sebaste, as well as manuscripts, especially gospel manuscripts. In fact, a colophon Grigor himself left describes the pedigree of one such gospel, which happened to be delivered to Avak, the son of Zakharit Ivane, under whose aegis Grigor fought. The manuscript was eventually trusted to Grigor, who wrote a colophon. Here, Grigor also first gave his, I would invent a neologism, matronymic, not patronymic, thus defining his noble status based on maternal line, and then, of course, mentioning also his father. The dynastic marriages and the fact that women were instrumental in legitimizing the rule of their husbands is, I think, a feature of a very fluid social situation at the end of the 12th century Armenia, which was aimed at sealing military and political alliances with women's original families. This, of course, does not mean that they yielded real power. They could just be pawns in the power politics. Of course, we should not exaggerate that there is evidence that they did, and I will go over some of it. We should not exaggerate. This was not a feminist revolution, of course. But it may be that we're seeing just the tip of the iceberg from what the sources are giving us. What examples do we have of real power? And how was this manifested, both symbolically and in reality, apart, for example, from the construction of the bridge, disposing of their wealth through pious donations, copying manuscripts, etc.? From the two brothers, Zachary and Ivane, the wife of the latter, Hoshak, is the more visible. She appears in inscriptions as cited above, where she calls herself queen, and made donations on her behalf after Ivane's death, and before the latter's son Avak took full power. She seemed to have acted as regent. An inscription from Kecharis, not dated precisely, but probably from 1227, lists first her. So it says, under the rule of our patron Hoshak and her son Avak. So she is the boss, it is what I think it is implying. The arrival of the Mongols, so this period of the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th, is when this newly emerging nobility is consolidating its power. And as we saw, women were important in forging links, etc. The arrival of the Mongols seems to have disrupted this balance, or to use a more neutral term, changed the paradigms that this consolidation of power was trying to achieve. Among others, for example, the once suppressed Orbelians resurfaced again and became one of their most trusted agents in Armenia. It is in this situation, too, that women both benefited but also suffered from the new circumstances. Let us look now at Ivane's daughter Tamti. As we saw above, around 1201-1203, when Liparit Orbelian came of age, Ivane tried to rein him in and reassure his loyalty by suggesting his daughter in marriage. Liparit preferred another wife. He got married to Apsa, who was the daughter of a Georgian prince. The source says because she was more beautiful, maybe. Yet Tamti turned out to be more useful, quite useful for Ivane. When Ivane set to conquer Khlat with his brother Zachary in 1210 from Shahi Armen al-Ashraf, it seems that one evening after a feast, Ivane, possibly under the influence of wine, wandered around and approached the enemy encampment too closely, and he was taken prisoner. There was great rejoicing in the enemy army to have such great luck. And despite the fact that Zachary offered a lot of money to ransom his brother, al-Ashraf would give him back only the price of his daughter. So Ivane had to bring Tamti and marry her to al-Ashraf. So we see, for example, in this case, she's just used as a pawn, seems like, in political games. Her subsequent life story represents the turbulent history and the important social changes that were taking place in Armenia. Already the fact that she was used as a diplomatic commodity in dealing with a Muslim ruler is important for appreciating the significance of women, regardless of whether they were happy about this or no. Whatever the case, when Khalat was sacked by the armies of the Khorez Shah Jalal ad-Din in 1220, Tamta was taken prisoner again and became the wife of Jalal ad-Din. The latter's capture meant that Tamta was taken to Karakorum and stayed there, according to Kyriakos Ganzaketsi, with the Khan. Her eventual release seems to have been negotiated by the Georgian queen Rusudan. Tamti was released after 1245 and received Khalat as the ruler, which had been conquered by the Mongols. The sources say that she received all of the territories and all of the rights that her husband once exercised. Giving the rule of a territory was not, of course, something unheard of at that time. Think only about Queen Tamar and her daughter Rusudan, to whom Tamar preferred to pass the rule on to. The appointment of Tamti to the rulership of Khalat may have been a way of checking the power of her brother Avak, who had also submitted to the Mongols and consolidated his power. This demonstrates how the Mongols exploited the existing rivalries between local Armenian lords, and their use of the female element in these rivalries was yet another novelty. Various Armenian princes, including Avak Zakarit, Sambat Orbelian, and Hasan Jalal, undertook journeys to Karakorum to submit to the Mongols. Through this way, they got tax exemptions for churches and legitimized their rule. Hasan Jalal's Colophon indicates some of the prerogatives that they hoped to get. Zakarit Prince Avak and Sambat Orbelian also made the voyage. The Mongols, of course, then exploited the rivalry between the Orbelians and the Zakarids too. We already talked about Tamti, whose appointment was probably, could be a move against his brother. There are other more explicit cases. Stepanor Orbelian, who we may presume doesn't really like the Zakarids because of the family history, but he seems especially badly disposed towards Avak's wife. He first talks how Avak hates Sambat and tries to calumniate him whenever he can. However, he implies that all of this enmity was fomented by his wife Gonza. The woman is told to have gone specifically to meet the governor Arghun along with her daughter Khoshak in order to create trouble for Sambat, an act which forced Sambat to undertake another journey to Karakorum. Not only, when Sambat actually went to Karakorum the second time and managed to create, through cunning or through skill, diplomacy, a great relationship with what he says, according to Stepanos, they were great friends with Hulegu, he convinced the latter to drown Gonza and marry off her daughter to a Mongol. He claims later that she poisoned her husband. We may never learn why Stepanos really dislikes Gonza, but I'm wondering, is there anything, can we suspect that this woman held real power and this was not to his liking? The sources also seem to indicate that there is some sort of female network, what I would call a female network in politics. The best case may be that of the Georgian queen Rusudan. I have a bit of small chronology here, and her conflict with her nephew, David IV. Rusudan took the reign of the Georgian kingdom after the death of her brother Georgi IV, or the Resplendent, but her rule was contested by some, and David IV was seen as a more legitimate heir. The Mongols used this conflict the most they could. Rusudan, however, had her own networks too. She herself did not feel strong enough to get rid of David outright, perhaps because he did have some support in Tbilisi, in the Georgian capital. Kyriakos Ganzaketi tells us that she tried to kill him. What she did, she turned to the Sultan of Iconium, Kiata Dinkai Khusrov II. What was her relationship to this person, to this sultan? Actually, in a raiding expedition of the Mongols in 1236-37, where the Georgians assisted the Mongols, they devastated the countryside and the walls of Sivas and Malatya. Since they retired, the Seljuk army moved into the Georgian territory trying to punish the Georgians, and the peace was bartered by giving Rusudan's daughter Tamar as wife of Kai Khusrov. According to Kyriakos Ganzaketsi, so she had her agent, her daughter, at the court of the Sultan of Konya or Iconium. According to Kyriakos Ganzaketsi, Rusudan sent David to Tamar and instructed her to get rid of him as fast as possible. Yet the plan did not materialize, since Kai Khusrov was wary of any further retaliations, possibly from Mongols, because the Mongols favored David, and they actually played David against Rusudan. Another example, which I would like to bring to your attention, of this female network, is the daughter of, again, Hasan Jalal and Maman, the persons in the Colophon. She was also named Rusudan. She was married to Boranoin. I think I have it somewhere, the son of Charmarun. In 1262, not long after the journey to Karakorum, Hasan Jalal fell out of favor, and there were rumors that he would be executed. Upon hearing that her father's life was in danger, Rusudan hurried to the court of Toghuz Khatun, the Christian wife of the Ilkhan Hülegu, in order to interfere for her father. Arghun, the governor, predicting such a course of events, immediately executed Hasan Jalal before any command from Toghuz Khatun or any interference could occur. So this is yet another example which shows that there was not only just dynastic marriages and the women were pawns, where in some cases this could be, but they could also be useful to their original families in different ways and exhibited or used their power in various ways. Just one more, and I think yes, I've gone over my time, not? Okay. I discussed the many dynastic marriages between women of Armenian nobility. I cannot go into this, but this kind of relationship also crossed religious lines. I already mentioned Tamti, who was married to Kai Khusrov, as we saw, whose mother was of Armenian origin too. We are told by Stepanos Orbelian that his father Tarsaic married Arzu Khatun, who was a Muslim. So Stepanos Orbelian's own mother was a Muslim who converted and became a pious Christian. It seems that, moreover, so this marriage is what kind of social structures did they bring or influences? It seems that Arzu Khatun was still alive when Tarsaic married the second time to Mina Khatun, the daughter of Hasan Jalal and Imam Khan. We keep hearing about these people. And lastly, I would like to briefly talk about women's ownership. It seems like they did have a way of disposing their money, which may not be completely new. But what is interesting, for example, in the law code of Mkhitar Ghosh, there is considerable amount of laws dedicated to describing the division of inheritance. Or any kind of imaginable scenario is described. So between a sister and a brother, between a married sister and an unmarried sister, a married sister who comes back to the father's house with or without the husband. What happens to the inheritance of the mother when the mother dies? Does it go to the sons, to the daughters? There is a lot of influence to keep the money or the wealth within the paternal line. So there's always a prohibition. Okay, if the mother dies, if a grandmother dies, the money goes back to her brother. If the brother is not alive, to her paternal uncle. So through the paternal line. And I'm wondering if this is an indication that in practice things may have been different and there is a preoccupation at insisting on the passage of money and property through the paternal line. If the daughter was not married and stayed at home, she inherited the same amount of wealth or property or whatever as the brother. If the daughter married, only half. But it is interesting that if she came back with her husband to live in her paternal family, she would have the same amount as her brother. So all of this indicate that there may be something going on with inheritance rights or with wealth passing through female line, which is not seen as something desirable. Finally, to conclude, I would like to talk about colophons more. Let me say one word, that reading through the 13th century colophons, women are much more visible than, let's say, the 12th century. Of course, this may be one of the reasons is we have a lot more colophons from the 13th century, so a lot more has survived. But still, it is normal, for example, for a scribe to commemorate, for example, his mother or the wife of his commissioner. But these people, these women, usually, at least in the 12th century, are not named. When we get to the 13th century, there's a lot more women who are named. My sister, this and this, my mother, my grandmother. And there is also something that I'm not sure how to interpret it, my spiritual mother. Aunts, maternal aunts, women become much more visible. So I am again wondering if this is just, again, the tip of the iceberg, showing changing structures, changing property rights, changing ways of dealing with wealth, which allowed women to be more visible, to commission their more common women, not princesses, urban dwellers who had money through trade or through whatever, to commission manuscripts and get their names through. So to conclude, there is evidence that women are more visible in the sources. Even if we say we don't know how much power they held, we may be exaggerating, romanticizing, but they are more visible. They are there, they are named with their names, we know who they are marrying. It's not just, okay, King Abbas had the sons who are named and 3 daughters. Normally we also get to know how the daughters are called. And my first interpretation, as I said, that this was the result of the Mongols, maybe 10% true. But the Mongols came when this process was already in place, when the social structures were changing at the end of the 12th century. They set the paradigm anew. They changed the balance of power. They used the rivalry of princely houses, including women, the use of women. So we may see this as a negative, manipulative power politics, but one of the results was that women were more involved in political life and could rely on, also in some cases, female networks within politics. Thank you so much for your attention.